Get the kids inside now. Ellen Dane's voice cracked as she stumbled through the blizzard, her lantern flickering against the howling wind. A man's groan, raw and desperate, led her to the stable, where a blood-soaked stranger lay crumpled in the snow, his dark eyes barely open. Heart-pounding, she dragged him toward the house, knowing the townsfolk would shun her for hiding a Comanche, and worse, his pursuers could be close. Why had this stranger appeared on her doorstep tonight, shattering the fragile peace of her struggling farm? Ellen Dayne, a 32-year-old widow, stood tall despite the weight of exhaustion, her calloused hands tending a crumbling farm on the harsh frontier. Left with debts from her drunken husband's shameful death, she raised her 8-year-old twins, Ruth and Josiah, alone. Their small faces often pinched with hunger. The townsfolk pitied her, but whispered about her refusal to remarry, while Ellis, a powerful landowner, pressed her to sell her land or accept his protection. Tahu, a Comanche warrior in his 30s, carried the scars of a life torn apart, his wife and son stolen by mercenaries in a brutal winter raid. Hunted as a criminal, he drifted, haunted by loss, until fate brought him to Ellen's door, wounded and hunted, threatening to unravel her precarious world. Wind howled through the cracks of Ellen Dane's farmhouse, rattling the shutters as she tugged them tight. Snow piled against the walls, and the cold seeped into her bones despite the flickering fire. She glanced at Ruth and Josiah, curled under a thin blanket, their breaths soft in sleep. A faint groan broke the storm's roar, low and pained, coming from the stable. Ellen froze, heart thudding, thinking it might be a wounded coyote. Grabbing the lantern, she wrapped her shawl tight and stepped into the blizzard, snow stinging her face. Near the stable, a man lay crumpled in the snow, blood soaking his torn shirt, his dark hair matted with ice, his shallow breaths clouded the air. Ellen's stomach churned at the sight of his Comanche braid, knowing the town's hatred for his kind. She could leave him to die, sparing her family the risk, but her hands trembled at the thought of his blood on her conscience. Kneeling, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him toward the house, his weight heavy against her. Ruth's scream woke Josiah as Ellen stumbled inside, the stranger's blood smearing the floor. "Stay back," she whispered, laying him near the fire. She tore cloth from an old skirt, pressing it to his gashed side, her fingers shaking. Locking the door, she peered into the storm, dreading Ellis's prying eyes. The man groaned, alive for now, but danger clung to him like the snow on her boots. Morning light barely pierced the frost-covered windows as Ellen stirred a pot of thin porridge. The stranger, Tahu, lay on a makeshift bed, his eyes fluttering open, wary and sharp despite his fever. He tensed as Ellen approached with water, his hand twitching toward a non-existent weapon. She kept her distance, nodding to Ruth and Josiah, who clung to each other behind the table. "He's family from far off," Ellen said softly, her voice steady despite the lie. The twins' wide eyes lingered on Tahu's braided hair, fear etched in their faces. Ellen moved him to a cramped storeroom behind the kitchen, piling crates to block the view from the window. She draped a quilt over the gap, her hands quick but careful. Hooves crunched outside, and her heart sank. Ellis's shadow loomed through the frosted glass before he knocked, his voice oily as he called her name. Ellen smoothed her apron, forcing a smile as she opened the door. "Heard a ruckus last night," Ellis said, his eyes scanning the room. "Just fixing the stable in the storm," she lied, gripping the doorframe to hide her trembling. Ellis stepped closer, his boots creaking, but found only the twins eating quietly. He left with a smirk, promising to return. Ellen sagged against the door, relief mixing with dread. Tahu's presence was a secret for now, but Ellis's suspicion hung like a noose, tightening with every visit. Ellen knelt by Tahu, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth as his fever broke. His eyes, less guarded now, followed her movements, but she saw no threat in them, only pain. Ruth peeked from the doorway, clutching a rag doll, her whisper barely audible. "Is he one of the bad ones, Mama?" Ellen's chest tightened, but she beckoned Ruth closer, brushing her daughter's hair. "Kindness matters more than what folks say," she murmured, though doubt gnawed at her. Tahu stirred, muttering about being hunted, his voice hoarse and broken. Ellen's fingers brushed a folded piece of hide in his torn jacket, its strange symbols unreadable. She tucked it into her apron, her pulse quickening, unsure if it held answers or danger. His warning about pursuers echoed in her mind, and she pictured Ellis's men or worse armed riders circling her farm. Stepping to the pantry, she counted their dwindling sacks of flour and potatoes, barely enough for 2 weeks. The weight of feeding her children, now with a stranger under her roof, pressed hard. She returned to Tahu, offering a spoonful of broth, her hand steady despite the fear curling in her gut. The hide's secrets and Tahu's pursuers loomed larger than the storm outside, and Ellen knew trusting him might cost more than she could afford. Dust swirled in the cold morning air as a wagon creaked up to Ellen Dayne's farm, loaded with sacks of flour and dried beans. The driver, one of Ellis's men, tipped his hat, but his eyes darted past her, scanning the yard. Ellen forced a tight smile, accepting the supplies while her stomach nodded. "Heard talk of strangers round here," the man said, leaning closer, his breath sour. Ellen shrugged, saying she'd seen no one, her hands clenched behind her apron. She declined Ellis's invitation to supper, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest, and the man's face hardened before he drove off. Later, Ellen circled the stable, her boots crunching on fresh snow, and froze at the sight of unfamiliar footprints near the hay bales. Her pulse raced, picturing Ellis's men snooping in the night. She ushered Ruth and Josiah inside, kneeling to meet their wide eyes. "Stay in the house. No wandering," she whispered, brushing Josiah's hair. In the storeroom, Tahu crouched by the wall, his ear pressed to a crack, catching the driver's words. He met Ellen's gaze, his voice low. "Ellis might be tied to the men hunting me." Ellen's breath caught, her mind racing to connect Ellis's greed for her land with Tahu's pursuers. She bolted the door, her fingers lingering on the lock, knowing secrecy was slipping through her grasp like sand. Ellis's shadow loomed larger, and hiding Tahu felt like balancing on a fraying rope. Firelight flickered across Tahu's face as he sat propped against the storeroom wall, his strength returning. Ellen handed him a tin cup of broth, watching his steady gaze soften. He spoke quietly, his words heavy, about his wife and son, slaughtered by mercenaries in a snow-choked valley. His fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles white. Ellen sank to the floor, her own grief rising as she told of her husband's drunken death, leaving her with debts and a broken farm. Her voice cracked, but she held Tahu's eyes, finding solace in shared loss. He touched the folded hide in her hand, explaining it mapped a mercenary stash, his voice trailing off. When Ellen pressed why he was hunted, he murmured, "I saw things no one should." Ruth slipped in, clutching a jug of water, and offered it to Tahu with a shy smile. His nod warmed the room, easing the tension. Ellen's heart lifted, sensing Tahu's loyalty, but the hide symbols haunted her, hinting at dangers beyond her farm. She tucked it into a tin box under her bed, her fingers brushing the cold metal, resolved to uncover its meaning. Ruth curled against her, and Ellen stroked her hair, whispering promises of safety she wasn't sure she could keep. Tahu's past wove into her own, a fragile bond forming, but the truth he held back cast a shadow she couldn't ignore. Hooves thundered outside as Ellen stirred the morning fire, her heart lurching. Rough voices shouted, demanding entry, and she glimpsed steel glinting through the window. Madden's mercenaries, 4 men with rifles slung low, pounded on her door. Ellen hissed at Ruth and Josiah to stay silent, shoving Tahu toward a loose floorboard in the storeroom. He slid beneath, his breath ragged, as she replaced the plank and scattered dirt to hide it. Smoothing her apron, Ellen opened the door, chin high, and faced the leader, his scar-twisted face unyielding, "No strangers here," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The men pushed past, boots thudding, and one tore through the kitchen, kicking over a chair. His hand grazed the storeroom door, inches from Tahu's hiding place, and Ellen's breath caught. Ruth, trembling, dropped a tin cup, the clatter echoing. The mercenary spun, cursing but focused on the spilled water, distracted. Ellen seized the moment, ushering them out with a sharp claim of needing to tend her children. The leader spat a warning to watch for fugitives before they rode off. Ellen collapsed against the door, her arms wrapping Ruth and Josiah, their small bodies shaking. Tahu emerged, his eyes dark with guilt, whispering Madden's name. Ellen's dread deepened, knowing Madden's reach was closing in, her farm no longer a sanctuary but a trap tightening around them all. Ellen sat across from Tahu in the dim storeroom, the lantern casting shadows on his weathered face. She clutched the folded hide, her voice low. "Who's Madden?" Tahu's jaw tightened, his eyes distant as he spoke of his family's slaughter, Madden's mercenaries burning their camp to ashes. He described Madden's raids, cloaked as military patrols, stealing from tribes and settlers alike. Ellen's fingers traced the hide symbols, her heart pounding as she realized it could expose Madden's crimes. She stood, pacing, her boots scuffing the floor. Hiding wasn't enough anymore. Her children's safety demanded action. Tahu offered to leave, his voice heavy, but Ellen shook her head, her eyes fierce. "You're not running. That's not right." Ruth slipped in, tugging Josiah's hand, and whispered, "Uncle Tahu," their trust softening the air. Ellen knelt, hugging them, her resolve hardening. She thought of Mary, her widowed friend, who might help rally others. Scribbling a note, she planned to send it tomorrow, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Tahu nodded, his strength returning, promising to stand by her. Ellen locked the door, her gaze lingering on the twins' sleeping forms, knowing confrontation loomed. The hide felt heavier in her pocket, a spark of hope and danger. But she couldn't turn back now. Moonlight filtered through the farmhouse as Ellen hammered nails into loose window frames, sealing gaps where prying eyes might peer. She whispered to Ruth and Josiah, their faces pale, to never speak of Tahu, even to friends. Outside, Tahu moved silently, repairing the stable's splintered fence, his hands quick despite his healing wounds. Ellen watched him, grateful but wary, her trust still fragile. Dawn broke, and she spotted a figure lurking beyond the pasture, a hat low over his eyes. Her pulse raced, suspecting Ellis's men. She grabbed a hoe, pretending to tend the frozen garden, her movements deliberate to draw the stranger's gaze. He vanished into the trees, but her stomach churned. Tahu joined her later, his breath clouding in the cold, and suggested digging a hideout under the stable. Ellen nodded, and under cover of night, they shoveled dirt, their hands blistered, creating a shallow pit lined with boards. Sweat stung her eyes, but the work steadied her nerves. They covered the entrance with hay, testing it until it blended seamlessly. Ellen stood back, her chest tight, knowing the hovel might save Tahu if trouble came. The stranger's shadow lingered in her mind, a reminder that eyes were watching, and her fragile secrecy teetered on the edge of collapse. Hooves crunched on the frost as Ellis rode up with 3 men, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. Ellen smoothed her apron, forcing calm as she opened the door, inviting them in with a tight smile. She led them to the kitchen, avoiding the storeroom, her heart thudding. Ellis's eyes roamed, his voice sharp. Heard of a fugitive hiding out. Josiah, stacking firewood, mumbled about someone in the house, and Ellen's breath caught. She laughed, saying it was a hired hand, long gone, her hands trembling behind her back. One of Ellis's men pushed toward the stable, kicking at the hay inches from the hidden pit. Ellen coughed loudly, drawing his attention, and offered weak coffee to stall. The man retreated, finding nothing, but Ellis leaned close, his breath hot. "Hide an enemy, and you'll lose everything." They left, dust trailing their horses, and Ellen sank to the floor, hugging Ruth and Josiah, tears burning her eyes. Their frightened faces steeled her resolve, but fear clawed at her. She checked the storeroom, finding Tahu unharmed, his nod grim. The near miss shook her, and she knew time was running out. Hiding Tahu was a fraying thread, and she had to act before Ellis's next move snapped it. Tahu stood in the yard, hammering a patch onto the leaking roof, his movement stronger each day. Ellen watched from the porch, her hands twisting in her apron, hope flickering as he blended into their lives. Ruth sat beside him later, giggling as she taught him hello and thank you, her small voice bright. Tahu's rare smile warmed Ellen's heart, easing her constant dread. Alone she unfolded the hide, studying its strange markings, her fingers tracing a symbol like a crooked star. Tahu joined her, explaining it marked a cache of Madden's stolen goods, his voice low with warning. "He'll kill to keep it secret," he said, and Ellen's throat tightened, picturing armed men storming her farm. She tucked the hide away, her mind racing. Madden's shadow loomed larger, and she needed answers. She decided to reach out beyond the farm, to someone who might know more. Mary's name surfaced, her friend's quiet strength, a lifeline. Ellen scribbled a note, her pen scratching in the lantern's glow, asking for help without mentioning Tahu. She sealed it, planning to send it with a neighbor's boy. Tahu's hammer echoed outside, a steady rhythm, but Ellen's hope was tempered by fear, knowing Madden's reach could crush them all. Ellen slipped the note into her pocket, her boots sinking into the snow as she scanned the horizon for Ellis's men. She approached a neighbor's boy fetching water, pressing the folded paper into his hand with a coin, her voice low. "Get this to Mary, no one else." He nodded, scampering off, and Ellen's chest tightened, praying he'd avoid notice. Mary's reply came by dusk, a scrap of paper promising a meeting tomorrow. Ellen read it by the fire, her fingers trembling, torn between hope and fear of leaving Tahu with the twins. She found him sharpening a knife, his eyes steady. "I'll keep them safe," he said, and she nodded, trusting his quiet strength. She checked her old hunting rifle, its barrel cold in her hands, and loaded it, her movements deliberate. Ruth and Josiah slept, their soft breaths a reminder of what she fought for. At dawn, Ellen wrapped her shawl, kissing the twins' foreheads before stepping into the cold. The farm faded behind her, and she whispered a prayer, her breath clouding in the air. Mary's help was a spark of hope, but leaving her children and Tahu felt like stepping onto thin ice, with danger lurking beneath. Ellen trudged through the snow to Mary's small cabin, her shawl tight against the biting wind. Inside, the fire crackled as Mary poured thin coffee, her face lined with worry. Ellen spoke of her struggling farm, her voice steady but eyes darting, avoiding Tahu's name. Mary leaned closer, whispering that the village buzzed with tales of a hunted Comanche, wanted for crimes. Ellen's stomach twisted, but she shrugged, asking about Madden's mercenaries, her tone casual. Mary's eyes narrowed, saying she'd heard of families vanishing after crossing Madden's path. She agreed to spread word against him, her nod firm, and Ellen's chest loosened with hope. Back at the farm, her boots crunched on fresh snow, and she froze, spotting new footprints circling the stable. Her heart raced, picturing Ellis's men closing in. Tahu met her at the door, his voice low, reporting a stranger who'd lurked near but didn't enter. Ellen's hands shook as she bolted the door, hugging Ruth and Josiah, their small bodies warm against her. Mary's support was a lifeline, but the footprints were a warning. Sharp as a blade, that Tahu's presence was no longer a secret. Ellen glanced at the storeroom, knowing danger was creeping closer, and resolved to act before it struck. A folded letter lay on Ellen's porch, its edges stained with mud. She unfolded it, her fingers cold, reading a scrawled demand to surrender the fugitive. The handwriting was Ellis's, but a crude symbol hinted at Madden's hand. She showed Tahu, his jaw tightening as they agreed to stand firm. In the yard, Tahu crouched with Josiah, pointing at tracks in the snow, teaching him to spot a stranger's tread. Ruth sat inside, her small hand stitching thicker curtains, her needle flashing to hide Tahu's shadow. Ellen checked the pantry, her heart sinking at the near-empty sacks, barely enough for weeks. She paced, her boots scuffing the floor, knowing Madden's men could return any day. Tahu's steady gaze met hers, and she nodded, vowing to find more allies. She wrote another note to Mary, her pen scratching fiercely, and tucked it away for the neighbor's boy. Ruth climbed into her lap, whispering fears of bad men, and Ellen kissed her forehead, promising safety. Josiah stood taller, mimicking Tahu's watchful stance, and Ellen's chest swelled with their courage. The letter's threat hung heavy, but their unity was a shield, fragile yet fierce, against the storm gathering beyond their walls. Tahu balanced a knife in his hand, showing Ellen how to grip it, his voice calm but firm. She mimicked his stance, her arm unsteady but determined, sweat beading on her brow. Outside, he walked the farm's perimeter, pointing to gaps in the fence where attackers could slip through. Ellen hauled logs with him, their breaths clouding as they wired stones to tripwires, setting traps. Ruth tugged Tahu's sleeve, asking about his family, her eyes wide. He froze, his face shadowed, and Ellen stepped close, touching his arm, sharing her own fear of losing her twins. Tahu's voice broke, promising no harm would come to them because of him. Ellen's throat tightened, feeling their bond deepen, but dread lingered like frost on her skin. They worked until dusk, hammering boards to reinforce the gate, their hands raw. Ruth and Josiah watched, clutching each other, and Ellen forced a smile, hiding her fear of what lay ahead. Tahu's pledge was a spark of strength, but the farm felt like a fort under siege, and Ellen knew no barricade could fully shield them from Madden's wrath. Stars glittered as Josiah crept to Ellen, whispering about a shadow near the fence. Tahu slipped outside, his footsteps silent, and returned with a grim nod, confirming Madden's scout. Ellen's heart pounded as they planned to mislead the intruder. She lit a lantern by the stable, hauling hay bales with loud thumps, her arms aching to draw the scout's eyes. Tahu slunk into the darkness, rustling bushes to mimic a fleeing figure. The scout's silhouette shifted, then vanished, chasing the false trail. Ellen doused the light, her breath shallow, and gathered Ruth and Josiah in her arms, their warmth grounding her. Tahu returned, his face taut, warning that Madden would act soon. Ellen's fingers brushed the rifle by the door, her resolve hardening. The scout's retreat bought them time, but the night felt alive with unseen eyes, and Ellen whispered a prayer, knowing each moment pushed them closer to a reckoning. Tahu sat by the fire, his voice low, detailing Madden's grip on sheriffs and judges, bought with blood money. He unfolded the hide, pointing to its scrawled lines, a plan to raise border towns for profit. Ellen's hands shook, picturing hundreds dead, their screams echoing in her mind. She clutched the hide, vowing to decode it, her voice fierce despite her fear. Tahu spoke of Hawk, a friend who knew Madden's crimes, and urged contacting him. Ellen hesitated, wary of another stranger, but nodded, trusting Tahu's judgment. She scribbled a letter to Hawk, her pen trembling, and entrusted it to the neighbor's boy, her eyes scanning for spies. Tahu sharpened his knife, his movements steady, while Ellen checked the traps outside, her boots crunching frost. The hide's secrets burned in her chest, a weapon and a curse, and Hawk's name was a faint hope. Madden's shadow loomed larger, but Ellen's fear fueled her fight, binding her to Tahu in a shared battle for survival. Dust rose as Ellis stormed up to Ellen's farm with 6 armed men, their rifles glinting in the noon sun. He pounded on the door, shouting about proof of a hidden Comanche. Ellen barred the way, her voice sharp, insisting no one was here, but Ellis shoved past, his men fanning out. Tahu slipped into the stable's hidden pit, pulling hay over the trap door, his breath shallow. A mercenary kicked at the stable floor, his boot scraping inches from the entrance, and Ellen's heart seized. She clutched her chest, staggering as if faint, collapsing to the porch with a gasp. The men froze, startled, and Ruth wailed, her sobs piercing the air, drawing their eyes. Ellen whispered to Ruth to keep crying, and the girl's tears flooded, halting the search. Ellis cursed, ordering his men out, but pointed at Ellen, his voice cold. "I'll be back with a warrant." The men rode off, and Ellen scrambled to the stable, pulling Tahu free, her hands shaking. His grim nod mirrored her dread. Ruth and Josiah clung to her, their faces pale, and Ellen's resolve cracked. The pit had saved Tahu, but Ellis's threat loomed like a gathering storm. Hiding was no longer enough. They needed a new plan, and fast, before the noose tightened around them all. Ellen clutched the hide as she knocked on Mary's door, her fingers tracing its worn edges. Mary welcomed her, pouring tea, and agreed to find someone to decode the symbols. She led Ellen to an old trader, his hands gnarled, who squinted at the hide under a flickering lamp. He traced the lines, his voice low, confirming it mapped a stash of Madden's stolen goods, looted from tribes and farmers. Ellen's stomach churned, picturing blood-soaked gold hidden in the hills. Back at the farm, she faced Tahu by the fire, her voice trembling as she asked why he kept it. He admitted stealing it from a mercenary, hoping to expose Madden, his eyes dark with guilt. Ellen nodded, tucking the hide into a tin box, her hands steady, despite the fear clawing her chest. She locked the box in a drawer, vowing to keep it safe, but Madden's shadow grew larger, his greed a threat to her family. Ruth and Josiah slept nearby, their soft breaths a reminder of what she fought for. Tahu's truth was a weapon, but Ellen knew if Madden learned of the hide, his men would burn her farm to ashes. The stakes were higher now, and every step felt like walking a razor's edge. Tahu sat by the hearth, his voice heavy as he recounted the night his family died. Flames had swallowed their camp, Madden's mercenaries slashing through, his wife's scream cut short. Ellen's throat tightened, and she shared her own isolation, shunned after her husband's death, her farm a lonely fortress. Ruth, hiding behind the door, overheard, tears streaming as she ran to Tahu, hugging him. His arms hesitated, then softened, cradling her. Josiah stepped forward, asking how to fight like Tahu, his small fists clenched. Tahu knelt, showing him how to scan the horizon for movement, his voice patient. Ellen watched, her heart swelling, seeing Tahu as more than a fugitive, a man she could trust. She stirred the fire, her mind racing with Madden's crimes, the hide's secrets, a constant weight. Ruth's embrace had eased Tahu's pain, and Josiah's eagerness strengthened their bond, but Ellen's fear lingered. Madden's men were out there, and the farm felt smaller, a fragile haven against a growing threat. She tucked Ruth into bed, her fingers lingering on her daughter's cheek, vowing to protect them no matter the cost. Tahu's past was theirs now, a shared fight, but the battle was far from won. Tahu prowled the farm's edge at dawn, his eyes catching fresh boot prints in the mud, too heavy for a villager. He signaled Ellen, his whisper urgent, confirming Madden's men were watching, ready to strike. Ellen's pulse quickened, and she suggested asking Mary about village rumors. She slipped to Mary's cabin, her shawl hiding her face, and Mary shared whispers of farmers losing land to Madden's schemes. Ellen's jaw tightened, realizing Madden's greed fueled Ellis's pressure on her farm. Back home, she and Tahu sat by the lantern, piecing together Ellis's role as Madden's lackey, their voices low. Tahu urged a direct strike, his hand on his knife, but Ellen shook her head, insisting on more proof. She traced the hide's symbols in her mind, its secrets, their best weapon. They agreed to stay cautious, fortifying the farm while seeking allies. Ellen checked the rifle, her hands steady, but fear gnawed at her. Madden's tracks were a warning, and Ellis's shadow tied them to a larger web. The farm was a battlefield now, and Ellen knew every choice carried the weight of her children's lives, pushing her to fight smarter, not just harder. A shadow moved near the stable at midnight, and Tahu signaled Ellen, his finger to his lips. He introduced Hawk, a lean man with sharp eyes, his bow slung across his back. In the storeroom, Hawk spoke of Madden's raids, entire tribes erased for land, his voice bitter. He handed Tahu another hide fragment, its markings matching the first, detailing Madden's hidden wealth. Ellen's hands shook, knowing this doubled their leverage but also their danger. Hawk admitted he was hunted too, his presence a risk, and Ellen's stomach knotted, picturing more mercenaries at her door. Hawk promised to rally native allies, his nod firm, and Ellen agreed to shelter him for the night, hiding him in the stable's pit. She bolted the door, her heart racing, and checked on Ruth and Josiah, their sleeping faces calm amidst the storm. Tahu's trust in Hawk eased her, but the new hide felt like a burning coal in her hands. Hawk's arrival was a spark of hope, but Ellen knew it also lit a fuse, drawing Madden's wrath closer. The farm was no longer just a refuge, it was a stronghold, and she braced for the fight ahead. Ellen chopped wood in the yard, her breath clouding in the chill. When Ellis's wagon rolled up, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, he leaned over the fence, pointing to fresh tracks near the stable, demanding to know who'd been there. Ellen gripped the axe, her voice steady, claiming she'd hired a hunter to guard the farm. Ellis's lip curled, unconvinced, and he waved his men to search the stable, their boots kicking up dust. Inside the pit, Hawk held his breath, his knife ready, but slipped through a loose board into the woods, leaving a scratch note for Tahu. The men found nothing, and Ellis spat, warning Ellen of consequences before riding off. Ellen's knees buckled, relief flooding her, but fear lingered like smoke. She found Tahu in the storeroom, reading Hawk's note, his face grim. They considered fleeing, but Ruth and Josiah's small hands clung to her skirt, their eyes pleading. Ellen shook her head, her jaw set, knowing the farm was their only stand. Tahu nodded, sharpening his knife, and Ellen checked the rifle, her fingers tracing its cold barrel. Ellis's visit was a blade at their throats, and they had to move faster, or the next search would end in blood. Tahu sat by the fire, his fingers tracing a scar across his cheek, his voice low as he spoke of facing Madden years ago. He'd lunged with a blade, grazing Madden's face, but was beaten down, left for dead. His eyes darkened, admitting fear that Madden would slaughter anyone who knew his secrets. Ellen knelt beside him, her hand on his arm, whispering that she too dreaded losing her twins but refused to live in terror. Ruth bounded in, holding a crayon drawing of Tahu by the farm, her smile bright. Tahu's face softened, a rare grin breaking through, and he ruffled her hair. Josiah asked how to survive the wild, and Tahu taught him to read the wind's direction, his voice patient. Ellen's heart warmed, seeing Tahu as family, a pillar she could lean on. She stood, her resolve hardening, vowing to expose Madden to the town. Ruth's drawing lay on the table, a symbol of hope, but Ellen's fingers brushed the hidden hide, its weight a reminder of the fight ahead. Tahu's past fueled their bond, and she knew they'd face Madden together, no matter the cost. Ellen and Tahu pored over the hide by lantern light, sketching its symbols onto paper, mapping Madden's stolen hoard. Hawk slipped in at dawn, his cloak damp, bringing word of a farmer, Eli, whose land Madden had seized. Ellen trekked to Eli's shack, her boots sinking in mud, and found him hunched, his eyes hollow. He confirmed Madden's threats, his voice shaking, but flinched at being a witness, fearing for his sons. Ellen pleaded, her hands clasped, promising protection, but Eli shook his head. Tahu offered to guard Eli's family, his stance firm, and Ellen sent a note to Mary urging her to spread Eli's story. Mary replied that some villagers doubted Madden, but Ellis's lies kept them loyal. Ellen's shoulders sagged, the map crumpled in her hand, hope flickering. She and Tahu walked back, their steps heavy, the farm's silhouette small against the sky. Eli's fear was a setback, but the map and Mary's whispers were sparks of progress. Ellen gripped Tahu's arm, her eyes fierce, knowing each clue brought them closer to dismantling Madden's empire, even as the village remained a divided battleground. Ellen stirred porridge when Mary's urgent note arrived, saying Eli had fled the village, scared off by Madden's men. Her spoon clattered, despair washing over her as the plan to expose Madden crumbled. Tahu paced, his voice sharp, suggesting they find Caleb, a mercenary who'd worked for Madden. Hawk nodded, revealing Caleb hid in a nearby town, carrying secrets that could ruin Madden. Ellen's heart raced, hope rekindling, but fear of the journey gnawed at her. She agreed to send Hawk, her hands trembling as she handed him a coin for supplies. Madden's men had ridden to Eli's shack, their pistols drawn, shouting threats until he packed and ran, his sons crying. Ellen pictured their faces, her own twin safety now at stake. She hugged Ruth and Josiah, their warmth grounding her, and checked the farm's traps, her fingers brushing the tripwires. Tahu sharpened his knife, his eyes distant, while Hawk slipped into the dusk, his bow slung low. Ellen's plan lay in tatters, but Caleb was a new thread, fragile yet vital. Madden's swift retaliation showed his power, and Ellen knew the next move had to strike harder, or her family would pay the price. Tahu stood in the stable, his pack slung over his shoulder, his voice low as he offered to leave to spare Ellen's family. Ellen grabbed his arm, her eyes blazing, saying abandoning him betrayed her heart's choice to save him. Ruth burst in, tears streaming, wrapping her arms around Tahu, begging him to stay as family. Josiah stood tall, vowing to fight for Tahu, his small fists clenched. Tahu's throat bobbed, his hand resting on Ruth's head, and he nodded, agreeing to stay. He urged Ellen to ready for battle, his tone urgent, and she checked her rifle, loading it with steady hands. She sharpened a kitchen knife, its edge glinting, and taught Ruth to hide in the pit if danger came. Josiah watched, mimicking her grip, his face set. Ellen knelt by the fire, whispering a prayer, her heart pounding with resolve and dread. Tahu's decision to stay bound them tighter, a family forged in defiance, but Madden's shadow loomed closer. The farm was a fortress now, and Ellen braced for the war she knew was coming, her children's lives the stake she couldn't lose. Hooves shook the ground as Madden rode up with 10 mercenaries, their rifles slung low, dust swirling around Ellen's farm. He dismounted, his scar-twisted face cold, barking for Tahu's surrender. Ellen stood on the porch, her hands clenched, voice steady as she declared Tahu family. Tahu stepped out, his eyes locked on Madden, and tossed his knife into the dirt, refusing to fight with Ruth and Josiah watching. Madden sneered, ordering his men to tear the house apart, their boots smashing crates in the kitchen. Nothing turned up, and Ruth trembled, clutching Ellen's skirt, while Josiah gripped Tahu's hand, his knuckles white. Madden's laugh grated, promising a larger force next time, and his men rode off, leaving churned mud. Ellen pulled her children close, their sobs muffled against her, her heart sinking with dread but burning with defiance. She locked the door, her fingers shaking, and met Tahu's grim nod. They'd won this round, no shots fired, but Madden's threat hung like a storm cloud, ready to break. Ellen kissed Ruth's forehead, vowing to protect them, knowing the next fight would demand more than words. Tahu circled the farm at dawn, tightening tripwires and stacking logs to reinforce traps, his hands steady despite the cold. Ellen knelt with Ruth, showing her how to flash a lantern thrice for danger, her voice calm but urgent. Tahu guided Josiah to a clearing, steadying the boy's grip on the hunting rifle, the barrel wobbling until a shot cracked, splintering a stump. Ellen counted their dwindling flour sacks, her stomach knotting, and scribbled a note to Mary, begging for village aid. Mary's reply came by dusk, promising some support but warning of Ellis's sway over others. Tahu sharpened stakes, his eyes distant, suggesting they confront Ellis to weaken Madden's grip. Ellen nodded, her jaw set, and hauled water to store, her arms aching. Ruth and Josiah watched, their small faces tense. And Ellen forced a smile, hiding her fear. The traps and rifle practice strengthened their defenses, but the farm felt like a fort under siege. Mary's hesitant allies were a flicker of hope, yet Ellen knew they needed more to survive Madden's next move, and every creak of the fence set her nerves on edge. Ellen marched to Ellis's grand house, her boots crunching gravel, and faced him in his polished parlor. She demanded he leave her family alone, her voice sharp. Ellis leaned back, smirking, saying she couldn't outrun Madden's power. Ellen's hands balled into fists, revealing she knew of his ties to Madden, and his face reddened, eyes narrowing. He stood, towering over her, threatening to seize her land if she defied him. Ellen held his gaze, her heart pounding, and turned to leave, feeling his stare burn into her back. At the farm, she told Tahu, her voice trembling with anger, and he suggested finding Caleb, a mercenary with direct proof against Madden. They sat by the fire, planning, their shadows long on the wall. Ellis's threat was a spark to dry grass, and Ellen knew he'd alert Madden soon. She checked the rifle, her fingers tracing its cold steel, resolve hardening. The confrontation had exposed Ellis's role, but it lit a fuse, pushing them closer to a clash they couldn't avoid, with Caleb as their next desperate hope. Hawk slipped into the farm at midnight, his cloak damp, whispering that Caleb hid in an abandoned warehouse nearby. He described Caleb's disgust with Madden's bloodlust, ready to betray him. Ellen and Tahu hunched over a map, plotting a night trek to reach Caleb, their voices low. Hawk offered to guide, warning Madden might suspect Caleb's disloyalty. Ellen's chest tightened, dreading leaving Ruth and Josiah, and she led them to Mary's cabin, kissing their foreheads, urging silence. Tahu checked his knife and bow, his movements precise, while Ellen tucked the hide in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder. They slipped out, the farm dark behind them, Hawk leading through frosted fields. Ellen's breath clouded, her thoughts on her children, but Caleb's knowledge was a key to Madden's downfall. The warehouse loomed ahead, a crumbling shadow, and Ellen braced for danger, knowing this risked everything but could change their fight. Moonlight barely lit the warehouse as Ellen, Tahu, and Hawk crept inside, boards creaking underfoot. Caleb huddled in a corner, his face gaunt, jumping at their approach, but nodding to talk. He whispered of Madden's plans to burn tribes and farms for land, his voice cracking. He pulled a tattered notebook from his coat, its pages listing Madden's raids, and Ellen's hands shook, grasping its power to ruin him. Tahu scanned the dark, his bow ready, as Caleb's words spilled faster. A shout broke the silence, mercenaries bursting through the door, pistols drawn. Hawk loosed an arrow, striking one man's shoulder, and Tahu tackled another, his knife flashing, blood spattering the floor. Ellen grabbed Caleb, shoving the notebook into her coat, and they ran, bullets splintering wood behind them. Hawk held the line, his bowstring twanging, giving them time to slip into the night. Ellen's lungs burned, Caleb stumbling beside her, but they reached the trees, Tahu covering their tracks. The notebook was theirs, a weapon to end Madden, but the mercenaries' shouts echoed, a relentless hunt that tightened the noose around them. Branches snapped under Ellen's boots as she sprinted through the dark forest, Caleb stumbling beside her, Tahu leading the way. Moonlight barely pierced the canopy, and the shouts of Madden's mercenaries echoed behind, their lanterns flickering like wolves' eyes. Tahu veered toward a stream, urging them to wade through, the icy water soaking Ellen's skirt, masking their tracks. Her heart pounded, thoughts of Ruth and Josiah at Mary's cabin driving her forward, a silent prayer on her lips. Caleb panted, whispering of Madden's bribes to sheriffs, his raids planned in secret meetings. They reached a shallow cave, its mouth hidden by vines, and crouched inside, breath clouding in the chill. Tahu rigged branches across the entrance, their snap meant to slow pursuers. Ellen clutched Caleb's notebook, its pages creased in her coat, her fingers tracing its edges, vowing to deliver it. The mercenaries' voices faded, but hoofbeats lingered, a relentless threat. Tahu's eyes met hers, his nod firm, and Ellen's resolve hardened. They'd escaped for now, slipping through Madden's grasp, but the cave was no sanctuary, only a pause in a hunt that would find them again. Hawk staggered from the trees, blood dripping from a gash on his chest, his bow limp in his hand. Ellen caught him as he fell, her hands slick as she tore her shawl to bind his wound, his warning of nearby mercenaries barely a whisper. Tahu urged they return to the farm, his voice tight, and Ellen nodded, fear choking her. They carried Hawk, his weight heavy, through the night, sticking to shadows to avoid patrols. At the farm, they lowered him into the stable's pit, his breath shallow. Ellen sent a frantic note to Mary begging for medicine, her pen shaking. She lit a lantern, cleaning Hawk's wound, her stomach twisting at his pale face. Tahu stood guard, his knife glinting, as distant hooves signaled Madden's men rallying. Ellen's hands trembled, picturing an attack, but she whispered to Hawk, urging him to hold on. Mary's boy delivered herbs by dawn, and Ellen brewed a paste, her fingers steady despite despair. Hawk's survival hung by a thread, and the farm was a target now, Madden's wrath closing in like a noose, but Ellen refused to break, her family's safety the fire keeping her moving. Ellen sat by Hawk's side in the pit, dabbing his fevered brow, her heart sinking as his breaths weakened. Madden's power seemed unbreakable, a shadow swallowing her hope. Tahu knelt beside her, his voice low, pointing to Caleb's notebook as their last chance to fight. Ruth and Josiah burst in from Mary's, their faces tear-streaked, clinging to Ellen, whimpering about bad men. She hugged them, her voice soft, explaining their plan to expose Madden, hiding her own fear. Tahu checked the farm's traps, tightening ropes, his movements precise but eyes heavy. Ellen led the twins to bed, their small hands gripping hers, and knelt by the fire, praying for strength, her resolve a flickering flame against despair. She tucked the notebook under her mattress, its weight a reminder of their fight. Tahu's words echoed, and Ellen stood, wiping her eyes, vowing to protect her children, even if it meant her life. The farm felt like a crumbling fort, but her determination burned, a spark refusing to die despite the darkness pressing in. Mary's voice carried through her crowded cabin, recounting Madden's crimes from Ellen's tales, her words sharp as she faced the villagers. Some farmers nodded, their faces grim, ready to join Ellen, but others shifted, wary of Madden's retaliation. Mary announced a secret meeting, and Ellen arrived, clutching Caleb's notebook, her boots muddy from the trek. She stood before the group, reading the notebook's accounts of burned villages and stolen land, her voice breaking as gasps filled the room. A woman wept, clutching her shawl, and Ellen's heart surged, sensing their anger. Two men muttered, swayed by Ellis's promises, and Ellen's jaw tightened, urging unity, promising to shield them from Madden's wrath. She passed the notebook around, its pages worn, a tangible truth. The farmer's nods were a spark, but doubt lingered, splitting the room. Ellen left, her shoulders squared, knowing she'd gained allies, yet the village's divide was a crack that could shatter their stand against Madden's power. Caleb stood in Mary's cabin, his voice hoarse as he faced the villagers, describing Madden's massacres, bodies left in smoldering ruins. Tears streaked his face, and Ellen steadied him, holding up the notebook, its lists undeniable. An old farmer rose, his voice trembling, saying Madden had driven his daughter from their land, and others murmured, anger rising. Ellen's chest swelled, hope flickering, as the room leaned toward her. Ellis burst in, his face red, shouting that Caleb lied, his hand on his pistol. The crowd wavered, and Ellen stepped forward, her eyes locked on Ellis, declaring the truth would reach the whole region. He sneered, threatening Madden's vengeance, and stormed out, his boots echoing. Caleb sank to a chair, exhausted, and Ellen gripped his shoulder, her resolve iron. The villagers' support grew, but Ellis's defiance was a storm cloud, promising a fight fiercer than any yet. Ellen tucked the notebook close, ready to face the battle ahead, her family's survival hinging on this fragile victory. Ellen hauled logs to the farm's fence, her arms aching as she and Tahu wired them tight, reinforcing their defenses. Hawk, pale but upright, sat in the stable fletching arrows, his hands slow from his wounds. Caleb pointed to the horizon, teaching Ellen to spot a mercenary's dust trail, his voice low and urgent. Ruth and Josiah scurried, filling buckets with water and stacking bread, their small faces set with purpose. Mary arrived with 5 villagers, their pitchforks and axes crude but ready, and Tahu drilled them in the yard, showing how to swing in pairs. Ellen watched, hope flickering, but her heart clenched at Ruth's nervous glance. She kissed Josiah's forehead, whispering they'd be safe, though fear gnawed at her. Tahu tested a tripwire. It snapped sharp in the dusk, and Ellen checked the rifle, her fingers steady despite the tension coiling inside. The farm stood stronger, a fortress of wood and will, but the air crackled with dread, every shadow a threat. Mary's allies were a spark, but Ellen knew Madden's attack would test their fragile stand, and her children's lives hung in the balance. Dawn broke red as Madden's mercenaries charged, 20 strong, their rifles spitting fire across the farm. Tahu shouted, triggering traps that snared horses, their screams piercing the air, slowing the enemy. Ellen crouched at a window, firing her rifle, the recoil jarring her shoulder as bullets splintered the walls. Hawk loosed arrows from the stable, each finding a mark, but his breaths grew ragged, blood seeping through his bandages. Caleb spotted a mercenary, once a friend, and yelled for him to defect, his voice drowned by gunfire. The fence buckled, mercenaries pouring into the yard, their blades flashing. Ellen screamed for the villagers to hold, her shots dropping a man, his body crumpling in the dust. Tahu swung an axe, felling another, blood spraying, but the enemy pressed closer, boots thudding on the porch. Ruth and Josiah huddled inside, their whimpers cutting through Ellen's focus. The farm teetered on collapse, every shot and swing a desperate stand, and Ellen's heart pounded, knowing they couldn't hold much longer against Madden's relentless tide. A mercenary lunged at Josiah, his knife raised, but Hawk dove forward, tackling him, the blade sinking into Hawk's side. Tahu dragged Hawk inside, blood pooling, but Hawk's eyes fluttered shut, his breath gone. Ellen fell to her knees, cradling him, tears streaming as she whispered thanks for his sacrifice. Ruth and Josiah trembled, staring at death's stark reality, their small hands clutching each other. Tahu's face twisted, vowing vengeance. But he rallied the villagers, his voice hoarse, urging them to fight. They surged, axes swinging, driving the mercenaries back, their retreat marked by scattered bodies. Madden rode off, shouting he'd return with more, his sneer chilling. Ellen hugged her children, their sobs shaking her, and stood, wiping her face, resolve burning through grief. The victory was bitter, Hawk's loss a wound deeper than any blade, but the farm held a fragile triumph. Tahu cleaned his axe, his eyes dark, and Ellen knew the next fight would demand everything they had left. Ellen knelt by Hawk's grave, the fresh earth cold under her hands, whispering a prayer for his soul. Ruth and Josiah clung to her, their tears soaking her dress, and she murmured they'd be safe, though her own heart faltered. Tahu surveyed the farm, noting broken fences and spent ammunition, his voice low, saying another attack would break them. Caleb suggested taking the notebook to a bigger town for justice, but Ellen shook her head, picturing Madden's bought judges. Mary arrived, her face grim, reporting some villagers had fled, terrified. Ellen's shoulders sagged, despair heavy, but she stood, vowing to find another way. She tucked the notebook under her mattress, its pages a faint hope against Madden's shadow. Tahu sharpened stakes, his hands steady, and Ellen checked the traps, her resolve a thin thread. Ruth's frightened eyes haunted her, but Ellen refused to surrender, her family's survival a fire she'd stoke, even as the farm felt like a crumbling wall against an unstoppable storm. Ellen and Tahu sat by the fire, plotting to present Caleb's notebook at a village meeting, their voices hushed. They tasked Mary with summoning everyone, even skeptics, her nod firm. Caleb agreed to testify, his hands shaking but eyes set. Tahu suggested raiding Madden's camp for more proof, his knife glinting, and Ellen's stomach knotted, knowing the danger. She had no choice, her children's future at stake, and sent Ruth and Josiah to Mary's, kissing their cheeks, her heart aching. Tahu checked his bow and arrows, his movements precise, while Ellen loaded the rifle, her fingers tracing its worn stock. They slipped out at dusk, the farm dark behind them, the plan a desperate gamble. Caleb's testimony and the raid were their last stand. But Ellen's fear pulsed, each step toward Madden's camp a leap into a fire that could consume them all. Stars glittered above as Tahu led Ellen and Caleb through the frost-crusted hills. Madden's camp a faint glow ahead. He crouched, pointing to sentries pacing near tents, their lanterns swaying. Ellen whispered a plan to pose as a lost farmer, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. Caleb nodded, indicating a small tent where Madden kept records, his hands trembling. Tahu rigged branches to snap underfoot, a distraction for their entry, his movements silent. Ellen clutched her shawl, whispering a prayer, her breath clouding as she steeled herself. They crept forward, weaving between trees, avoiding the sentry's gaze, their boots muffled on the frozen ground. Tahu's hand signaled a halt when a guard turned, and Ellen's pulse raced, her body pressed against a pine. The guard moved on, and they slipped into the camp, shadows among shadows, the tent's flap just ahead. Ellen's fingers brushed the rifle slung across her back, her resolve afire against the cold. The raid was a gamble, every step risking discovery. But the documents inside could end Madden's reign, and she pushed forward, driven by her children's faces. Inside Madden's tent, Tahu pried open a small safe, its hinges creaking, revealing a stack of papers. Caleb rifled through, pulling out ledgers of raids, while Ellen found a letter from Ellis, its words tying him to Madden's crimes. Her hand shook, stuffing the papers into her coat, hope surging. A guard shout split the night, his whistle shrilling as lanterns flared. Tahu drew his knife, slashing at a mercenary who charged, blood spraying as the man fell. Ellen grabbed Caleb, sprinting for the trees, bullets whizzing past, splintering bark. Tahu fought, his blade a blur, carving a path for their escape, his shoulder grazed by a shot. They plunged into the forest, mercenaries' boots pounding behind, and Ellen clutched the papers, her lungs burning, vowing to deliver them. The evidence was theirs, a weapon to shatter Madden, but the camp's alarm echoed, a relentless chase that threatened to swallow them whole. Tahu splashed through a shallow stream, urging Ellen and Caleb to follow, the cold water erasing their tracks. Caleb limped, a bullet grazed on his leg, oozing blood, but he gritted his teeth, keeping pace. Ellen's thoughts raced to Ruth and Josiah, safe with Mary, her fear of Madden's vengeance, a weight in her chest. They stumbled into a rocky overhang, its shadow hiding them, and crouched, breath ragged. Tahu scanned the papers, nodding grimly, confirming their damning details of Madden's crimes. Ellen tore a strip from her skirt, binding Caleb's wound, her hands steady despite dread. She lit a match, signaling Mary to ready the village meeting, the flame flickering in the dark. The mercenaries' shouts faded, their search veering, but Tahu whispered Madden would now target the farm. Ellen gripped the papers, her resolve iron, knowing they'd escaped, but the fight loomed larger. The cave was a brief shelter, and she pictured her children's faces, pushing her to keep moving. The evidence, their only hope against the storm coming for them. Ellen staggered into the farm at dawn, Tahu and Caleb behind, the stolen papers heavy in her coat. Mary met them, reporting the village rallied, axes and rifles ready to face Madden. Ellen handed out weapons, showing farmers how to aim, her voice firm despite exhaustion. Tahu tightened tripwires, his hands raw, fortifying traps around the farm. Ruth and Josiah ran from Mary's, tears streaming, and Ellen knelt, hugging them, promising safety, her heart aching. Caleb stood before the villagers, his voice breaking as he listed Madden's atrocities, sparking fury in their eyes. Ellen checked the rifle, her fingers tracing its stock, and tucked the papers under her mattress, a final weapon. The farm buzzed with defiance. Villagers standing shoulder to shoulder, but tension hung thick, every creak a warning. Ruth's small hand squeezed hers, and Ellen's resolve burned, ready to fight for her children, even as fear whispered of the blood to come. Madden's army struck at first light, 30 mercenaries charging, their gunfire a deafening roar. Tahu triggered traps, ropes snapping to trip horses, their screams mixing with men's shouts. Ellen fired from a window, her rifle's kick bruising her shoulder, bullets tearing through the walls. Caleb swung an axe, felling a mercenary, but a shot grazed his chest, blood soaking his shirt as he staggered. Ruth, panicking, darted outside, screaming for Ellen, and a mercenary snatched her, his pistol to her head. Ellen's cry tore the air, begging Madden to free her daughter, her rifle falling, hands raised. Madden laughed, his scar glinting, taunting her surrender. Tahu slipped behind the barn, his knife drawn, eyes locked on Ruth, moving silent as a shadow. The battle raged, villagers' axes clashing with mercenaries' blades, blood staining the dirt, and Ellen's heart pounded, her daughter's life, the stake in a fight teetering on collapse. Tahu crept through the dawn mist, his knife glinting as he neared Madden's makeshift camp, Ruth's small form bound near a fire. He sliced her ropes, his movements swift, and pulled her into the trees, her stifled sobs muffled against his shoulder. Ellen fired her rifle from the farmhouse. Unaware of Ruth's rescue, each shot a desperate plea, bullets tearing through the porch. Tahu sprinted with Ruth, dodging mercenary shouts, their lanterns bobbing in pursuit, and wove through the forest, his arm shielding her. At the farm, he handed Ruth to Mary, her tear-streaked face breaking into a smile as she hugged him, whispering thanks. Tahu's jaw tightened, his vow to end Madden burning, and he grabbed his bow, racing back to the fight. Mary rushed to Ellen, shouting Ruth was safe, and Ellen's knees buckled, relief flooding her as she reloaded, her hands steadier. She fired again, dropping a mercenary, his body slumping in the dirt, her heart now fueled by hope. The battle roared on, villagers swinging axes, blood staining the ground, but Ruth's safety was a spark, driving Ellen to fight harder, knowing Tahu was out there, carving a path to Madden. Ellen rallied the villagers, their axes and rifles pushing back Madden's mercenaries, bodies littering the yard. She stood on the porch, holding Caleb's notebook and the stolen papers, her voice ringing as she read Madden's crimes, from burned villages to murdered families. Caleb staggered forward, blood soaking his shirt, and shouted of Madden's orders to slaughter, his words igniting fury. The villagers roared, turning on Madden, their loyalty to Ellis crumbling. Madden bellowed for an attack, but his men hesitated, eyes darting to the crowd. Tahu charged from the shadows, tackling Madden, their knives clashing, steel scraping as blood sprayed. Tahu drove his blade into Madden's chest, the man's scar-twisted face frozen in a final snarl. Ellis bolted, but farmers seized him, binding his wrists, his curses fading. Ellen lowered the papers, her hands trembling, tears mixing with dust on her cheeks. The mercenaries fled, their hoofbeats distant, and the farm fell silent, victory heavy with cost. Caleb slumped, supported by a villager, and Ellen met Tahu's gaze, their shared triumph, a fragile light against the bloodshed. Smoke curled from smoldering fences as villagers doused fires, their faces streaked with soot. Ellen knelt, hugging Ruth and Josiah, their arms tight around her, her sobs quiet as she kissed their heads, grateful they lived. Tahu stood apart, staring at the horizon, his hand resting on his knife, whispering Hawk's name, grief etched in his eyes. Caleb, bandaged by a farmer's wife, vowed to rebuild the village, his voice weak but earnest. Mary led a group, carrying baskets of bread and blankets, her smile warm as she embraced Ellen. The villagers' gifts piled on the porch, silent apologies for past doubts, and Ellen felt the weight of isolation lift, her heart lighter. She and Tahu exchanged a look, no words needed, their bond a new family forged in fire. The farm bore scars, bullet holes, and bloodstains, but it stood, a testament to their fight. Ellen tucked the notebook away, its purpose served, and gripped Ruth's hand, knowing justice came at a price, one hawk and others paid, their memory a quiet ache. Ellen hammered nails into the farmhouse, Tahu hauling timber beside her, villagers lending hands to mend the battered walls. Ruth and Josiah chased each other in the yard, their laughter bright, the first joy in months. Tahu chose to stay, his quiet presence a shield, his bow always near. Farmers dropped off quilts and grain, their nods respectful, admitting they'd misjudged Ellen. She hosted a supper, tables laden with stew, Mary and Caleb laughing with the crowd, the farm alive with warmth. At dusk, Ellen stood by Hawk's grave, her fingers brushing the earth, promising to live well for his sacrifice. She gazed at the horizon, the sky clear, peace settling over her despite the scars of loss. Ruth called her, and Ellen smiled, joining her children, Tahu at her side. The farm was home again, a haven built on courage, its future bright but marked by the cost of their victory, a balance of hope and sorrow.